Welcome to our last video on personality, where you're going to be given an overview on how personality is assessed. There are different ways that we can assess personality, and we're just going to look at a couple of different approaches. And if you're interested in learning more about this, I would encourage you, especially if you are a behavioral and social science major, to consider when you do transfer, taking a personality class. Very interesting, because you can study these theories and the approaches to measuring personality in a lot greater depth. As we begin to reflect on assessment and its use in studying personality, I think it's beneficial for us to think about how we can use assessments to better ourselves and to better understand ourselves. So I want to start out by asking you if you ever feel anxious when taking a test. Probably every one of you has felt anxiety at some point, but for some of you, this anxiety that you experienced may be more pervasive. It may be happening more often, or it may be negatively affecting your test scores. It may cause you to avoid courses. So I want to share with you some approaches to measuring test anxiety. And so one approach to measuring test anxiety is what's called the State Trait Anxiety Inventory. And another is called the Taylor Manifest Anxiety Scale. And I'll be putting links to both of these on this module. You'll find those on the content page on D2L for this module. Test anxiety is considered a trait, but one that occurs in a very specific situation. And many measures of test anxiety have been developed, and there's much research showing that high and low test anxious individuals do differ, which supports the idea of test anxiety as potentially being a personality variable. So, for example, in one study, researchers found that high test anxious participants who were given neutral feedback reacted as though they had been given negative feedback and predicted low future success for themselves. Low test anxious participants were much more optimistic about their future performance after receiving neutral feedback. So anxiety is a complex phenomenon with many nuances. Much of the anxiety research does indicate that it may be a personality variable depending on what component of anxiety is being measured. So I wonder, what do you think based on what you've learned about personality? As I mentioned, I'll be placing links to these test anxiety measures. Researchers know that when we feel anxious, our memory, our ability to focus, and our ability to learn are each affected. If you feel that you have test anxiety, or if you complete one of these assessments or any other one that you find online, I want to share with you that there are many helpful tools and resources available to help you. I'll be placing some helpful resources related to reducing test anxiety within this module on D2L. In addition, if this is something you feel is significantly affecting any grades in any of your classes, or if it's just affecting you in general and causing you a lot of distress, I'd encourage you to take advantage of the free counseling that's offered by the Northeast State Counseling Center, as they can provide you with some very helpful approaches to reducing this type of anxiety. So self-report inventories, this is where someone is asking you to fill out some sort of scale or measurement. They're often used for employment, for job training. They might be used in criminal cases, custody battles, and they can also be used to assess psychological disorders. These self-report inventories are objective. Now, that doesn't mean that people aren't going to use some form of self-deception or deceive others. Maybe they don't want to be aware of their own traits, or maybe they don't want you to be aware. But it's objective in the fact that it is standardized. There's a standard way of administering these tests and a standard way of scoring. And the most well-known personality tests also have high levels of reliability, meaning that if you were to take this test at different points in time, you'd likely find similar scores. And this is measured statistically, actually, among groups of people. And they also have high levels of what we call validity, which means that a validity, and there are different types, but overall, they are looking at, is the test measuring what it intends to? So are the questions aligned with the constructs of whatever we're measuring? So in other words, are we asking questions related to extroversion if we're measuring extroversion? And this is something that the test developer would identify, but they would also send this out to other people who are experts to identify, the whether or not they thought that this was a valid measure. You could also compare the test to other personality tests to see if there's a relationship, which would let you know, especially I'm talking about those that are already established and have validity and reliability and are standardized. And if the scores are highly correlated, this tells us it's a valid measure. And then measures like this can also be predictive. So there's something called predictive validity. How much can we predict about this trait that we would be, how much of a behavior, or what can we see in a behavior or expect to see in a behavior that is because of how someone has scored on a particular trait. So if someone scores, for example, high in hypochondriasis, if you look at the bottom of Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, the heading, that's one subscale. What are we able to predict? And for many tests, we can make predictions about behavior. And you can see here are some sample questions that are people respond to on the MMPI, and this is a very long test, and it needs to be something that is administered the same way every time and scored the same way every time, because your score is compared to other scores, and this then helps the person who's doing the testing to know, is your score, is it within the normal range? Are you outside of the norm? Go back to what you learned about in the intelligence chapter with normal distributions. Where do you fall on that distribution for whatever measure whatever type of construct they're measuring, okay? And then another approach to measuring personality is through projective testing. And this relies on what's called projection, which, as we looked at earlier, this is a type of defense mechanism where we are projecting unconscious impulses onto something else. In the example I gave, it was onto the driver who was aggressive. Here, with testing, it's onto ambiguous stimuli. So ambiguous means it's unclear. There's no clear image that we can detect necessarily. Now, I would like to point out that when we think about no clear image, you might look at this image on your screen, and this is an example of a Rorschach Inkblot, and it is not clear at all. It just looks like some ink. But when I say ambiguity, we can also associate that with something where it's just a photograph or an image of something that doesn't have any particular easily discernible thing like task or activity going on, which could be interpreted in a multitude of ways, in other words. So we have the Rorschach Inkblot Test, which is a type of projective test where the person interprets a series of these symmetrical inkblot cards, and this is supposed to reveal unconscious feelings and struggles. Then we have what's called the Thematic Apperception Test, and there are ambiguous cards that are actually, they look like photographs or images of, might be of a person or more than one person, and the image can be interpreted in many different ways. And so the consistent, the person who is measuring this is going to look for your consistency. What are you tending to to say about some of these images that you're looking at? And this could, what you say about these images is giving insight into your social world, revealing your hopes, your fears, interests, and goals. Projective tests can be, are thought of by many to be helpful because they are relying on interpretation of ambiguous images. You don't know how what you say is related to how the person will, or that person, the person who's doing the analysis or the testing, to their interpretation. So it's harder for you to do that self-monitoring and have control or to regulate what you're saying in relation to how you want to come across. So this is a little bit different. And it's also interesting too, because it's thought to reveal what's going on in your unconscious as well. And then we have what's called the Rotter incomplete sentence blank. And this is where an individual is asked to complete 40 incomplete sentences as quickly as possible. And this is thought to reveal their desires, fears, and struggles. Why do you think it's as quickly as possible? Why would that be important? Well, if you're revealing something quickly, then you're not taking the time to control what you're saying. And so you're more likely then, if we're trying to assess unconscious processes, to reveal what's in your unconscious and also to reveal your real desires, fears, and struggles. So this is it for our chapter on personality. What I would like you to do is be sure to have read your book. Make sure that you've gone through the questions on your student learning guide. You don't need to answer all of them in writing. I think if you know the answers overall and you can think of examples, that might be your approach to studying. For some of you, you might find it helpful to be writing your responses. But I would encourage you to make sure you're thinking not only about how you would define the terms and concepts that I'm asking you to think about, but think about their actual application. And try to think about how you might compare each of these approaches in specifically relation to the personality chapter. And of course, let me know what questions you have. Thank you again. Here are two examples of images used in the Thematic Apperception Test. As you can see here, the participant is asked to tell a story about the ambiguous image, and then these narratives are then compared to standardized scoring systems to gain understanding of the individual behavior patterns. So in this video, you've learned about some of the approaches used to assess personality. You learned about the self-report approach and an example of this approach called the MMPI. You also learned about projective testing and two examples of this approach to personality assessment that are called the Rorschach Inkblot and the Thematic Apperception Test. As you read your textbook and after you've watched the videos on personality, please don't hesitate to reach out to me with any questions that you have.